Richard slammed the divorce papers on the kitchen table while Vivian cradled her 7-month pregnant belly, the sound echoing through their dream home like a gunshot. Vivian Harper had believed she was living a fairy tale, married to tech millionaire Richard Sterling for 3 blissful years, expecting their first child, living in their beautiful home overlooking San Francisco Bay. The marble countertops gleamed under pendant lights she'd chosen with such care, and family photos smiled down from every surface. But fairy tales don't prepare you for the moment your husband serves you divorce papers while you're making his favorite lasagna. "I can't do this anymore, Vivian," Richard said, his voice cold as winter rain streaming down their floor-to-ceiling windows. "Brooke makes me feel alive again. The yoga teacher, the one with the perfectly flat stomach and spiritual quotes that sounded profound until you actually thought about them. The one who'd been helping Richard with his stress management for the past 6 months, teaching him to breathe deeply and find his center. Apparently, his center was located somewhere between her meditation mat and her apartment." Vivian's hands shook as she read the legal documents, her wedding ring catching the light like a tiny lighthouse in a storm. The papers outlined Richard's demands with clinical precision division of assets, custody arrangements, and his claim to half of everything, including the modest inheritance she'd mentioned from her late parents. Her millionaire ex-husband wanted to strip away every piece of their life together, including money that had never truly belonged to either of them. "You're really doing this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of evening traffic. "While I'm pregnant with your child." Richard loosened his silk tie, the same shade of blue she'd given him for their anniversary. "The pregnancy was an accident, Vivian. We both know that. I'm 38 years old, and I feel like I've been sleepwalking through my life. Brooke showed me there's more than this suburban housewife routine." Suburban housewife routine. 3 years of supporting his business ventures, hosting dinner parties for his clients, managing their household so he could focus on building sterling technologies. 3 years of being the perfect wife to a man who now saw her dedication as suffocation. "What about our marriage vows?" Vivian asked, placing a protective hand over her belly where their daughter moved restlessly, as if sensing the upheaval in her mother's world. "For better or worse, remember, I was young and naive when I said those words," Richard replied, checking his expensive watch. "People change. Vivian, I've changed. I need someone who understands my spiritual journey, not someone who thinks meditation is just sitting quietly." The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so devastating. Richard speaking about spiritual journeys while abandoning his pregnant wife for a yoga instructor who quoted ancient wisdom between designer workout sets. His narcissistic abuse had been subtle at first, small criticisms, gentle corrections about her appearance or opinions, but pregnancy had amplified his cruelty into sharp, undeniable focus. "Where will I go?" Vivian asked, though she already knew the answer. She'd been planning for this possibility since Richard started coming home late, smelling like sandalwood and making comments about her expanding waistline. "That's not my problem anymore," Richard said, gathering his keys and wallet. "The prenup protects my assets, and you'll get alimony for the kid. You'll be fine." He paused at the door, and for a moment, Vivian thought he might apologize, might recognize the magnitude of what he was destroying. Instead, he said, "I'll be staying at Brooks until you can find somewhere else to live. My lawyer will be in touch." The front door closed with the finality of a coffin lid, leaving Vivian alone in the kitchen that had once represented everything she'd wanted: a home filled with love, laughter, and the promise of forever. Now it felt like a museum displaying the artifacts of her failed marriage. She sank into the breakfast nook where they'd shared thousands of meals, where Richard had proposed on a snowy Christmas morning, where she'd told him about the pregnancy with such joy and anticipation. The divorce settlement papers spread across the table like a roadmap to her destruction, each paragraph methodically dismantling 3 years of shared dreams. Her phone buzzed against the granite countertop, and Vivian's heart jumped, hoping Richard had come to his senses. Instead, she saw a text from Grandfather Howard, the message that would change everything. "Emergency family meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. Time to tell Richard who you really are." Vivian stared at the message, her fingers trembling as she set the phone down. For 3 years, she'd lived as Vivian Harper, the ordinary marketing coordinator who'd captured a millionaire's heart through coffee shop meetings and Target shopping trips. She'd hidden her true identity so completely that even she sometimes forgot the magnitude of what she'd sacrificed for love. Harper Airlines, $12.6 billion, a family empire that owned half the sky. Her millionaire ex-husband had no idea he was divorcing one of the wealthiest women in America. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, and Vivian placed both hands on her belly, drawing strength from the life growing inside her. "Your daddy thinks he's trading up, baby girl," she whispered to her unborn daughter. "He has no idea what he's trading away." Outside, San Francisco glittered in the twilight, millions of lights representing millions of dreams. Some dreams died in kitchen conversations over legal documents, but others were just beginning. Vivian Harper Sterling had spent 3 years pretending to be ordinary. But Harper women had built an empire on the foundation of never being anyone's second choice. Tomorrow, Richard would discover that his midlife transformation had cost him more than a marriage. It had cost him access to a dynasty that could have secured his daughter's future for generations. But first, Vivian had a decision to make. Would she use her family's power to win him back, or would she finally embrace the strength she'd been hiding for the sake of a love that had never been real? The divorce papers rustled in the evening breeze from the air conditioning, and Vivian gathered them into a neat stack. Her prenup, carefully crafted by the Harper family attorneys, would protect her assets just as Richard believed it protected his. The man who spoke so confidently about financial independence and divorce settlements had signed away any claim to billions without realizing it. Women supporting women, her grandmother had always said. Sometimes that meant protecting yourself from men who saw you as disposable the moment someone younger and more convenient appeared. Vivian stood up slowly, her hand supporting her lower back as she moved toward the stairs. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would reshape everything. But tonight, she needed to rest and prepare for the battle ahead. Richard Sterling thought he was divorcing a middle-class woman with a modest inheritance. He was about to learn he'd made the most expensive mistake of his life. Vivian had spent 3 years pretending to be ordinary, but Harper Airlines owned half the sky. The next morning, Vivian drove through the familiar streets of her childhood toward Harper family headquarters, her belly pressed against the steering wheel of her modest sedan. She'd chosen this car carefully 3 years ago, something unremarkable that wouldn't raise questions about her background. Now, passing the sleek corporate campus where her family's jets gleamed on private runways, the deception felt like a costume she was finally ready to shed. Harper Airlines wasn't just a company, it was a legacy built by her great-grandfather during the barnstorming era, expanded by her grandfather into a commercial empire, and modernized by her father before his death. $12.6 billion in assets, roots spanning 6 continents, and political connections that reached the highest levels of government. The Harper name opened doors that money alone couldn't touch. But Vivian had walked away from all of it at 25, tired of watching cousins marry gold diggers and friends betray family secrets for tabloid money. She'd changed her name from Vivian Harper Montgomery to simply Vivian Harper, moved across the country, and taken a job as a marketing coordinator, earning $42,000 a year. She'd wanted to be loved for herself, not her family's financial independence. The executive elevator carried her to the 60th floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. This was where she'd spent childhood afternoons, where her grandfather had taught her about business, and her grandmother had shared wisdom about navigating a world that would try to diminish her simply because she was born female. "You've played house long enough, sweetheart," Grandfather Howard said as she entered his oak-paneled office. At 72, Howard Harper commanded respect from world leaders and corporate titans, but his eyes softened when they landed on his pregnant granddaughter. "That boy wants to divorce you while you're carrying his child. Time he learned what family he's messing with." Margaret Whitfield, the family's steel-spined attorney, rose from her leather chair with predatory grace. Margaret had been protecting Harper interests for 30 years, and she'd never lost a case involving more than $10 million. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her navy suit cost more than most people's monthly salary. "We've been preparing for this day since you got married," Margaret said, sliding a thick folder across the mahogany conference table. "Richard Sterling's net worth is $8 million. Your trust fund turns over more than that every quarter." Vivian sank into the familiar embrace of her grandfather's favorite chair. the same spot where she'd done homework as a child while corporate negotiations swirled around her. The leather still smelled like her grandfather's cologne and her grandmother's perfume, a combination that meant safety and unconditional love. "I really thought he loved me," Vivian said, her voice catching on the admission. "For 3 years, I believed our marriage was real." "It was real to you," Howard replied gently, moving to the window where Harper jets taxied for takeoff. "You gave that boy the greatest gift possible, authentic love, from a woman who asked for nothing in return. His narcissistic abuse wasn't about your worth, sweetheart. It was about his character." Margaret opened the folder to reveal financial statements that would make Fortune 500 CEOs weep with envy. Harper Airlines stock certificates, real estate holdings spanning from Manhattan penthouses to Colorado ski lodges, investment portfolios that grew 7 figures annually in interest alone. The numbers represented more than wealth, they represented power, influence, and the ability to shape destinies. "Your prenup was crafted by our finest legal minds," Margaret explained, her manicured finger tracing over the relevant clauses. "Richard's lawyer assumed your modest family inheritance meant a few $1,000s and some family photos. The fine print states that it includes all current and future Harper family holdings." Vivian laughed despite herself, a sound that held more pain than humor. "He thought he was protecting himself from a gold digger. Men like Richard Sterling see women as accessories to their success stories," Howard said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built an empire from nothing. "They trade wives like they trade cars, always convinced the newer model will bring them happiness. They never consider that true wealth comes from loyalty, respect, and shared purpose." The irony was devastating in its completeness. Richard had spent 6 months complaining about their finances, suggesting Vivian get a better job or contribute more to their household expenses. He'd criticized her for shopping at Target instead of Nordstrom, for clipping coupons instead of hiring a housekeeper, for living modestly when he wanted to project success. Every criticism had been a rejection of the authentic life she'd chosen, the simple existence that had allowed their love to grow without the corruption of financial expectation. "But first," Howard said, his eyes gleaming with the strategic brilliance that had built their family fortune, "let's give Mr. E. Sterling exactly what he's asking for." Margaret smiled, and Vivian recognized the expression from childhood, the look her family's attorney wore when she was about to destroy someone who'd underestimated Harper women. "We let the divorce proceed exactly as Richard planned. When he discovers your true identity, it'll be too late to change course." "Why not? What about my daughter?" Vivian asked, placing both hands on her belly where the baby moved restlessly. "She deserves to know her father, even if he's not the man I thought he was." "Your daughter will inherit one of the greatest fortunes in American history," Howard replied. "She'll have opportunities her father couldn't imagine in his wildest dreams. The question is whether Richard Sterling deserves to be part of that legacy." Through the office windows, Vivian could see the city spread out below like a living map of possibility. Somewhere in that urban landscape, Richard was probably planning his future with Brooke, calculating alimony payments and custody schedules, believing he held all the cards in their divorce settlement. He had no idea that his pregnant wife could buy his entire company with the quarterly interest from her trust fund. "There's something else," Margaret said, producing a second folder. "We've been investigating Miss Brooke Meadows since she entered Richard's life. Her background is interesting." The photographs Margaret spread across the table told a story that made Vivian's blood run cold. Brooke at charity galas with different wealthy men, Brooke at wedding ceremonies under different names, Brooke accepting settlement checks from divorce attorneys in 3 different states. The woman Richard believed was his spiritual salvation had made a career of targeting successful men during vulnerable transitions. "Women supporting women doesn't mean protecting predators," Margaret said coldly. "Ms. Meadows has destroyed 3 marriages and disappeared with substantial settlements each time. Richard isn't her first midlife transformation, he's her latest mark." Vivian studied the evidence with growing clarity. Richard's spiritual awakening, his sudden dissatisfaction with their marriage, his conviction that Brooke understood him better than his wife of 3 years, all of it had been carefully orchestrated by a professional who made her living destroying families. "Do we tell him?" Vivian asked. "We let him discover it himself," Howard replied. "Men like Richard need to learn consequences, not receive rescue from women they've underestimated. Your job isn't to save him from his choices, it's to protect yourself and your daughter from the damage he's causing. The baby kicked hard, and Vivian winced, pressing her hand against the sharp movement. Her daughter seemed to sense the tension in the room, the weight of decisions that would shape her entire future. This child would grow up knowing her worth wasn't determined by men who saw women as replaceable, who measured love in terms of convenience and ego gratification. I want him to know the truth, Vivian decided, her voice growing stronger with each word. All of it, but I want him to face that truth after he's committed to his choice, after he's burned every bridge and shown his true character. Margaret nodded approvingly. We arrange a meeting at his office, neutral territory, where he can't claim ambush or manipulation. We present the facts clearly and give him 24 hours to reconsider his position. And if he still proceeds with the divorce, then Richard Sterling learns that his midlife transformation just cost him access to $12.6 billion and the respect of one of America's most powerful families. Howard said with satisfaction. Some lessons are expensive. Sweetheart, this one will cost him everything. Vivian stood slowly, her hand supporting her lower back as she moved toward the door. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would reshape her entire world. But today, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the return of her own power. Richard Sterling thought he was divorcing a middle-class woman with a modest inheritance. He was about to discover he'd made the most catastrophic mistake of his life, and by then, it would be far too late to undo the damage. The Harper legacy would continue, protected and strengthened by women who refused to be anyone's second choice. Richard's lawyer discovered the prenup they signed wasn't what anyone thought it was. At Brooks' apartment, Richard celebrated his newfound freedom with expensive champagne that bubbled like his excitement for the future. The space reflected Brooks' carefully curated spiritual aesthetic crystals arranged on floating shelves, meditation cushions scattered across hardwood floors, and inspirational quotes written in flowing calligraphy on canvas prints. Everything felt clean, uncluttered, and refreshingly different from the family-focused chaos his life had become with Vivian's pregnancy. I can't believe I waited so long to do this, Richard said, loosening his tie as he paced between Brooks' yoga mats. Vivian's just a middle-class girl who got lucky when she married me. The prenup protects my assets, and she'll get standard alimony for the kid. Nothing that'll impact my financial independence. Brooks smiled from her position in lotus pose, her perfectly flat stomach highlighted by designer athletic wear that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. The universe rewards authentic choices. Richard, you're finally honoring your true self instead of playing a role that no longer serves you. But when Richard's lawyer, David Chen, examined the prenup more carefully that afternoon, his face went white as fresh snow. David had been Richard's attorney for 8 years, handling everything from business contracts to real estate deals, and he'd never seen anything like the document spread across his mahogany desk. Richard, we have a problem, David said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. This prenup doesn't protect your assets. It protects hers. Richard stopped mid-sip of his victory scotch, the liquid suddenly tasting like ash in his mouth. That's impossible. You reviewed that document yourself before we signed it. I reviewed what I thought was a standard prenuptial agreement, David replied, flipping through pages of legal text with growing horror. The language seemed straightforward: protection of premarital assets, standard alimony provisions, custody arrangements, but the fine print reveals something very different. David's finger traced the relevant section, his voice growing more strained with each word. Your wife's modest family inheritance isn't listed as a dollar amount. It's defined as all current and future Harper family holdings. I assume that meant a few $1,000s and some family photos. I never investigated further because Vivian presented herself as a woman of modest means. The scotch glass slipped from Richard's fingers, shattering against the Persian rug like his confidence in the divorce settlement. What exactly are we talking about here? I've spent the morning researching Harper family holdings, David said, producing a folder thick with financial documents. Richard, your wife isn't from a middle-class family with a small inheritance. She's the primary beneficiary of the Harper Airlines empire. Net worth $12.6 billion. The number hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, incomprehensible in its magnitude. Richard's entire net worth was $8 million, impressive by most standards. but microscopic compared to the fortune his wife had been hiding. His millionaire ex-husband's status suddenly felt like calling himself tall when standing next to Mount Everest. "That's impossible," Richard repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. Memories were reshaping themselves in his mind. Vivian's uncanny knowledge of business strategy, her calm during financial stress, her insistence on modest living despite his pressure to upgrade their lifestyle. She shops at Target. She clips coupons. She was living below her means, David explained, loosening his tie as if the office had suddenly become unbearably hot. Dramatically below her means. "Richard, your wife could buy your entire company with pocket change." Meanwhile, Vivian sat in her hotel room, hands resting on her belly as she spoke to her unborn daughter. The space was comfortable but anonymous, a far cry from the luxury she could afford but had chosen to avoid. She'd checked in under her maiden name, paying cash to avoid creating paper trails that might complicate the divorce proceedings. "Your daddy thinks he's trading up, baby girl," she said softly, feeling the child move restlessly inside her. "He has no idea what he's trading away. But maybe that's for the best. Maybe you and I deserve better than someone who sees love as a business transaction." A knock at the door interrupted her meditation. Travis Montgomery stood in the hallway, her college friend turned investigative journalist, holding a manila envelope that would change everything about Richard's understanding of his spiritual awakening. "I've got news about your husband's yoga teacher," Travis said, settling into the room's single armchair. At 34, Travis had built a reputation for exposing con artists and financial predators, his investigative skills honed by years of following money trails that led to human devastation. "Vivian, Brooke Meadows isn't who she claims to be." Travis opened the envelope to reveal photographs, documents, and a timeline that painted a disturbing picture of calculated manipulation. "Her real name is Rebecca Williams. She's done this before twice. Same pattern, same techniques, same devastating results for the families she targets." The evidence was damning in its thoroughness. Rebecca Williams from Phoenix, who'd married and divorced tech executive Marcus Webb after claiming pregnancy and receiving a $2 million settlement. Ashley Thompson from Denver, who'd convinced real estate mogul Bradley Harrison to leave his wife of 15 years, then disappeared after a quickie Vegas wedding and subsequent annulment netted her $3 million. "She targets successful men going through midlife transitions," Travis explained, his voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone who'd seen too many variations of the same human tragedy. "Offers spiritual guidance, sexual validation, and emotional support during vulnerable periods. Then she claims pregnancy to accelerate marriage and maximize settlement potential." Vivian studied the photographs with growing clarity about her own situation. Richard's sudden spiritual awakening, his dissatisfaction with their stable marriage, his conviction that Brooke understood his authentic self, all of it had been carefully orchestrated by a professional who made her living destroying families for financial gain. "The pregnancy test in Brooke's bathroom wasn't hers," Travis continued, producing surveillance photos taken with a telephoto lens. "She's been using the same prop for 3 different cons. The woman your husband believes is carrying his child is running the same script she's used to manipulate 2 other wealthy men." The irony was devastating in its completeness. Richard had abandoned his pregnant wife for a woman whose pregnancy was fake, trading authentic love for manufactured spiritual connection, choosing someone who saw him as a mark rather than a partner. His narcissistic abuse had made him vulnerable to abuse from someone whose manipulation skills far exceeded his own. "Do we tell him?" Vivian asked, though she already knew the answer. "We let him discover it himself," Travis replied. "Men like Richard need to learn consequences, not receive rescue from women they've underestimated. Besides, exposing Brooke now might make him think you're trying to sabotage his happiness. Better to let him face the truth after he's committed to his choices." Napravwar back at David's office, Richard paced between windows that offered a view of the city where his wife had been living a double life for 3 years. The financial documents spread across the desk represented more than wealth, they represented power, influence, and opportunities he'd never imagined possible. "Can we contest the prenup?" Richard asked desperately. "Claim fraud or misrepresentation?" David shook his head grimly. "She never lied about her background, Richard. She simply didn't volunteer information about her family's wealth. The prenup clearly states that you understood her financial position when you signed it." Your failure to investigate further shows negligence, not fraud on her part. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Vivian had protected herself using the same legal mechanisms Richard had insisted upon, turning his desire for financial security into the instrument of his own financial destruction. Every conversation about money, every criticism of her modest lifestyle, every demand that she contribute more to their household expenses, all of it had been happening while she possessed wealth that could have solved every problem he'd ever imagined. "What's my exposure?" Richard asked, though he dreaded the answer. "In a traditional divorce, you might expect to keep your premarital assets and split anything acquired during the marriage," David explained carefully. "But this prenup reverses that protection. Vivian's trust fund and family holdings remain entirely hers, while your assets become vulnerable to community property laws." Richard's phone buzzed with a text from Brooke. "Can't wait for our new life together. Baby, the universe is aligning perfectly for us." Reading those words while staring at documents that revealed his wife's true wealth felt like watching his entire world reshape itself in real time. His midlife transformation had led him to abandon a woman worth billions for a con artist whose pregnancy was as fake as her spiritual awakening techniques. The ultimate question wasn't whether he could afford to divorce Vivian, it was whether he could afford not to try winning her back. But as David gathered the prenup documents with the care reserved for legal explosives, Richard realized that some mistakes create consequences too expensive to undo. His divorce settlement was about to become the most costly midlife crisis in American history, and the woman he'd underestimated held all the cards he'd never known existed. The pregnancy test in Brooke's bathroom wasn't hers, it was planted evidence. Travis Montgomery had built his investigative career on following money trails and exposing predators who targeted vulnerable people during life transitions. Now, sitting in his cluttered home office surrounded by surveillance equipment and legal documents, he was unraveling the most sophisticated con he'd encountered in 15 years of journalism. "Your husband's spiritual awakening wasn't spontaneous," Travis told Vivian over a secure phone connection. "Brooke Meadows has been planning this seduction for months, studying Richard's patterns, identifying his vulnerabilities, and positioning herself as the solution to problems she helped create." The evidence filled 3 filing cabinets and painted a disturbing picture of calculated manipulation. Brooke had researched Richard's business schedule, learned his favorite coffee shop, and arranged to be there during his morning routine. Her first conversation with him hadn't been chance, it had been choreographed to appeal to his specific psychological needs during a period when Vivian's pregnancy was making him feel trapped and overlooked. "She targets successful men experiencing major life changes," Travis explained, scrolling through his computer files. "Marriage, parenthood, career stress. Aging, these transitions create emotional vulnerability that professional manipulators exploit." Richard's complaints about feeling disconnected from his authentic self weren't original thoughts. They were planted suggestions that Brooke cultivated over months of seemingly casual conversations. Security footage from Richard's office building revealed the extent of Brooke's preparation. She'd entered the building 3 times before her first official appointment with Richard, always with different men who matched a specific profile: successful, middle-aged, married, and displaying signs of midlife dissatisfaction. Each visit had been reconnaissance, gathering information about building security, Richard's schedule, and potential escape routes if her con was discovered. "She's not working alone," Travis continued, producing photographs of Brooke meeting with a man in his 50s at expensive restaurants throughout the city. Marcus Webb, her first victim from Phoenix, has been helping her identify targets and refine her techniques. He's become her business partner in what amounts to a marriage destruction enterprise. Vivian felt sick as she absorbed the implications. Marcus Webb was the tech executive who'd left his pregnant wife for Rebecca Williams, only to discover her pregnancy was fake after he'd already paid a $2 million settlement. Instead of learning from his mistake, he'd become complicit in destroying other families, perhaps believing that helping Brooke hurt other men would somehow validate his own foolish choices. "The pregnancy announcement was scheduled for maximum impact," Travis said, producing a timeline that showed Brooke's calculated escalation. She waited until Richard was fully committed to the divorce before revealing what she claimed was his child. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was designed to eliminate his options for reconciliation with you. The fake pregnancy test had been purchased 3 months earlier, part of a kit that included multiple positive tests, pregnancy pillows, and even synthetic urine samples that would fool basic medical examinations. Brooke had been using the same props for years, adapting her timeline to match each target's specific vulnerabilities and financial situation. Meanwhile, Richard sat in his office at Sterling Technologies, staring at financial reports that suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the wealth his wife had been hiding. His business partner Shane Parker knocked on the door, carrying coffee and concern about Richard's recent behavior. "You've seemed distracted lately," Shane said, settling into the chair across from Richard's desk. At 29, Shane was younger and more idealistic than Richard, still believing in concepts like loyalty and authentic love. "Everything okay with the divorce proceedings?" Richard laughed bitterly, the sound echoing off his office windows that offered a view of the city where his entire understanding of reality was being rewritten. "Vivian's been lying to me for 3 years. Shane, she's not who I thought she was." "What do you mean?" "She's rich," Richard said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Not comfortable or well off. Rich. Billionaire rich. Harper Airlines rich. And I've been criticizing her for shopping at Target while she could buy my entire company with pocket change." Shane set down his coffee cup with the careful precision of someone processing shocking information. "Wait, Harper Airlines. Your wife is connected to Harper Airlines." "She's not connected to it," Richard replied, his voice hollow with the magnitude of his miscalculation. "She owns it. Or will, eventually. Her family built that empire, and I've been treating her like some gold digger who lucked into marrying above her station." The irony was so complete it felt like a cosmic joke. Richard had spent months complaining about Vivian's lack of ambition, her satisfaction with modest living, her refusal to leverage their marriage for social advancement. Every criticism had been a rejection of choices she'd made to live authentically, to find love based on character rather than financial opportunity. "Richard," Shane said carefully, "Harper Airlines contracts with major tech companies for their corporate travel management. If your divorce becomes public knowledge, it could impact our business relationships across multiple sectors." That hadn't occurred to Richard, the possibility that his personal decisions might have professional consequences extending far beyond his own company. Harper Airlines influenced industries ranging from aerospace to hospitality, with political connections that reached the highest levels of government. Alienating the Harper family wouldn't just cost him personally, it could destroy Sterling Technologies and impact every employee who depended on their success. "There's something else," Richard said, producing the divorce papers that had seemed so straightforward 24 hours earlier. "The prenup I thought was protecting my assets actually protects hers. If this divorce goes through, I could lose everything I've built." Shane studied the legal documents with growing alarm. As Richard's business partner, Shane owned 30% of Sterling Technologies, which meant Richard's financial destruction could impact his own future security. The personal had become professional, the private had become public, and the consequences were expanding like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. "You need to fix this," Shane said bluntly. "Whatever it takes. Whoever you need to apologize to, whatever bridges you need to rebuild, you fix this before it destroys everything we've worked for." But some bridges become impossible to rebuild once they've been burned completely. Richard had served divorce papers to a pregnant billionaire while abandoning her for a con artist whose fake pregnancy was part of a criminal enterprise targeting wealthy men. The level of betrayal, disrespect, and sheer stupidity involved in his choices had created consequences that apologies couldn't address. Travis finished compiling his evidence and prepared to deliver the final piece of information that would complete Vivian's understanding of her situation. "There's one more thing you need to know about Brooke's pattern," he told Vivian. "She always claims pregnancy to accelerate marriage, but she's never actually carried a child to term. Every pregnancy has ended in convenient miscarriage after the divorce settlement is finalized." The calculation was horrifying in its completeness. Brooke used fake pregnancies to manipulate vulnerable men into abandoning their families, then used fake miscarriages to avoid the long-term commitment of actual parenthood. She'd perfected a system that destroyed marriages, devastated children, and left entire families emotionally and financially traumatized while she moved on to her next target. "Your husband isn't just being conned," Travis said. "He's become complicit in a criminal enterprise that specifically targets pregnant women and their children. When Richard abandoned you for Brooke, He became part of a pattern that destroys families for profit. Vivian felt her daughter kick forcefully, as if the baby sensed the danger surrounding their family. This child would grow up knowing that her father had chosen money and ego gratification over loyalty and love, that he'd abandoned her before birth for a woman whose entire identity was constructed to prey on men like him. The truth was becoming clear. Richard's midlife transformation hadn't been about finding his authentic self. It had been about succumbing to manipulation from a professional who understood that men's narcissistic abuse patterns made them vulnerable to specific types of exploitation. Women supporting women meant protecting each other from predators who used fake spiritual awakening and manufactured pregnancy to destroy families. It also meant recognizing when men's choices revealed character flaws too fundamental to forgive. Vivian's financial independence would protect her daughter from the consequences of Richard's catastrophic judgment. But no amount of money could undo the emotional damage he'd inflicted by choosing a con artist over his pregnant wife. The investigation was complete, the evidence was overwhelming, and the time for truth had arrived. Richard's mother had hired 3 private investigators to research Brooke, and all 3 found different identities. Maureen Sterling stood in her pristine Marin County kitchen, surrounded by the evidence that would shatter her son's delusions about his spiritual awakening. At 65, Maureen had survived her own catastrophic marriage to Richard's father, a charming narcissist who'd nearly destroyed their family fortune through gambling and affairs. She recognized predatory behavior when she saw it, and everything about her son's yoga teacher screamed danger. "Richard, you need to listen to me," Maureen said into her phone, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned expensive lessons about trusting appearances. "This woman you're planning to marry is not who she claims to be." "Mother, I'm not discussing my personal life with you," Richard replied from Brooke's apartment, where he was packing his belongings and planning their future together. "Brooke understands me in ways Vivian never did. This isn't about you." Maureen spread 3 separate investigation reports across her marble countertop, each one revealing a different layer of Brooke's constructed identity. The first investigator had found Rebecca Williams from Phoenix, divorced twice. No children despite multiple pregnancy claims. Last known address, a luxury apartment that she'd abandoned without paying 6 months of rent. The second investigator had uncovered Ashley Thompson from Denver, married to real estate mogul Bradley Harrison for exactly 93 days before disappearing with a $3 million settlement, leaving behind fake medical records and a forwarding address that led to a mail drop in Nevada. The third investigator had discovered the most disturbing information. Brooke Meadows from San Francisco had no legitimate background at all. Her yoga certification was purchased online, her references were fake, and her apartment was rented under an identity that wouldn't survive serious scrutiny. "Richard, this woman is a professional," Maureen said, her voice shaking with frustration and fear for her son's future. "She's destroyed 3 marriages and stolen millions of dollars from men who thought they were finding true love. You're not her first midlife transformation, you're her latest mark." "That's impossible," Richard insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Brooke is carrying my child. She's helping me find my authentic self after years of feeling trapped in a marriage that was suffocating my spiritual growth." Maureen closed her eyes, recognizing the language of manipulation that she'd heard from her own husband 40 years earlier. Men were so predictable in their vulnerabilities, so eager to believe that younger women found them irresistible, so willing to abandon responsibility for the fantasy of renewed youth and unlimited possibility. "The pregnancy is fake, Richard," Maureen said bluntly. "Just like her previous pregnancies were fake. Just like her entire identity is fake. She's been using you to practice divorce fraud, and you've been too flattered by the attention to see what's really happening." Richard hung up on his mother, but doubt had been planted. That afternoon, while Brooke taught a private yoga session to another wealthy client, Richard searched her apartment with the thoroughness of someone whose entire future depended on what he found. Hidden in Brooke's bedroom closet, beneath yoga mats and meditation cushions, Richard discovered evidence that confirmed his worst fears. Pregnancy tests, dozens of them, all positive, all manufactured by the same company that specialized in theatrical props. Pregnancy padding designed to simulate different stages of fetal development, medical documents with names that didn't match any of Brooke's claimed identities. But the most damaging evidence was a notebook filled with detailed observations about Richard's behavior, preferences, and psychological vulnerabilities. Target responds well to spiritual language and ancient wisdom quotes. One entry read, "Complains frequently about wife's pregnancy, making her unattractive and demanding. Excellent candidate for rapid extraction and maximum settlement." Extraction, settlement, target, the language of predatory business, not authentic love. Richard's hands trembled as he read entries that deconstructed their entire relationship into calculated manipulation. His spiritual awakening had been manufactured through specific triggers that Brooke had identified and exploited. His dissatisfaction with Vivian had been amplified through subtle suggestions and comparative criticism. Even their sexual chemistry had been engineered through techniques Brooke had perfected with previous targets. "She makes me feel alive again," Richard had told everyone who would listen, but the truth was that Brooke had made him feel exactly what she'd intended him to feel, using psychological manipulation techniques that professional con artists employ to separate wealthy men from their families and fortunes. Meanwhile, at Harper family headquarters, Vivian made the decision that would change everything about her approach to the divorce. "I want Richard to know the truth," she told grandfather Howard and Margaret Whitfield. "All of it. Before the baby comes, before he commits completely to his choice, I want him to understand exactly what he's throwing away." Howard nodded approvingly from behind his massive desk, where he'd negotiated deals worth billions and built relationships with world leaders. "Your grandmother always said Harper women handle their business directly. We don't manipulate or scheme, we present facts and let people make informed decisions about their own futures." Margaret arranged a meeting at Richard's office for the following afternoon, neutral territory where emotions couldn't be blamed for whatever revelations emerged. "We'll present the financial information clearly and give him 24 hours to reconsider his position," she explained. "After that, the choice becomes permanent." But when they arrived at Sterling Technologies the next day, they discovered Richard wasn't alone. Brooke sat beside his desk, her hand possessively on his arm, wearing Vivian's wedding ring on a chain around her neck like a trophy from a conquered enemy. "Actually," Brooke said with a smile sharp as broken glass, "Richard and I have an announcement of our own." Vivian felt her daughter kick forcefully, as if the baby sensed the confrontation about to unfold. This moment would determine not just the future of her marriage, but the foundation upon which her child would understand concepts like loyalty, authenticity, and the true cost of betraying people who love you unconditionally. Richard looked between his pregnant wife and his yoga teacher, unaware that the next few minutes would force him to choose between fantasy and reality, between manufactured spiritual awakening and genuine family legacy, between a con artist's temporary validation and a billionaire's permanent love. The Harper family fortune could survive Richard's betrayal, but his daughter would grow up knowing that her father had chosen money and ego gratification over loyalty and commitment. Some consequences create generational impact that no amount of financial independence can undo. Margaret opened her briefcase with the precision of someone preparing for legal warfare, while Vivian placed both hands on her belly and prepared to reveal truths that would reshape her husband's entire understanding of the life he was choosing to abandon. Women supporting women sometimes meant protecting yourself from men whose narcissistic abuse made them vulnerable to even worse manipulation from professional predators. The time for truth had arrived, and Richard Sterling was about to discover that his midlife transformation had cost him everything worth having. Brooke's pregnancy announcement would have been more convincing if she hadn't forgotten to hide the fake belly padding. The tension in Richard's office was thick enough to cut with a knife as Brooke Meadows prepared to deliver what she believed would be the final blow to any hope of reconciliation between Richard and Vivian. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the scene like a stage set for a drama that would determine the future of multiple families. "Richard and I are expecting a child together," Brooke announced, her hand moving to her abdomen in a gesture of protective motherhood that would have been touching if it weren't completely fabricated. "The universe has blessed our authentic connection with new life." Vivian watched her husband's face transform with joy, wonder, and the vindication he'd been seeking for his decision to abandon his pregnant wife. Richard stood up from his desk chair, moving toward Brooke with the reverence of someone who believed he was witnessing a miracle rather than a performance. "This changes everything," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "Vivian, you have to understand this proves that my choice was guided by something larger than myself. The universe is showing me that Brooke and I are meant to build a life together." But Travis Montgomery, waiting in the lobby with professional surveillance equipment, was capturing photographs that would expose Brooks' deception with devastating clarity. Through his telephoto lens, he could see what everyone in the office had missed: the subtle bulk around Brooks' midsection that suggested padding rather than pregnancy, the careful way she positioned herself to avoid profile shots, and most damning of all, a corner of synthetic material that had shifted during her dramatic announcement. "Before we discuss your announcement," Margaret Whitfield said with the calm authority of someone who destroyed more experienced liars than Brooke Meadows, "there's something about Mrs. Sterling's identity that requires clarification." Margaret placed a folder on Richard's desk, the leather portfolio containing documents that would rewrite his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his wife, his marriage, and his financial future. "Mr. Sterling, your wife isn't who you believe her to be. There's nothing I need to know about my soon-to-be ex-wife," Richard snapped, his attention focused entirely on Brooke and the child he believed she was carrying. "Whatever games you're playing, Margaret, they won't change my decision. I found real love, real connection, and real purpose with Brooke." "Actually," Margaret replied with the smile of someone holding royal flush, "there is something quite significant you should know. Vivian Harper is the primary beneficiary of the Harper Airlines Trust. Net worth $12.6 billion. The office fell silent except for the hum of Richard's computer and the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below. Numbers that large don't immediately register in the human brain. They require time to process, context to understand, and usually multiple repetitions before their magnitude becomes clear. Richard's face went through a sequence of emotions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, calculation, recognition, and finally, naked greed. The transformation was so complete and obvious that even Brooke could read the implications written across his features. "This is impossible," Richard whispered, sinking back into his chair, as if the weight of his mistake was physically crushing him. "You shop at Target, you clip coupons, you drive a Honda Civic." "I wanted to be loved for myself," Vivian replied simply, her hand protective over her belly, where their daughter moved restlessly. "Not my family's money. I spent 3 years being authentic with you, Richard. Every moment of our marriage was real on my side." Brooke's face went pale as she performed her own calculations. She'd spent months researching Richard Sterling, studying his business ventures, calculating his net worth, and positioning herself to extract maximum value from their relationship. Her entire con had been based on the assumption that Richard was the wealthy target and Vivian was the obstacle to be removed. Now she realized she'd been manipulating the wrong person entirely. "Richard, baby," Brooke said, her voice taking on a desperate edge as she tried to regain control of the situation. "Money doesn't matter when you have real spiritual connection. What Vivian's offering you is just material wealth. What we have is authentic love." But Richard's attention was entirely focused on the financial documents spread across his desk. Harper Airlines stock certificates, real estate holdings, investment portfolios, trust fund statements, numbers so large they redefined his understanding of wealth and power. His wife, the woman he'd been preparing to divorce, could buy his entire company with the quarterly interest from her trust fund. "This can't be legal," Richard said, his voice cracking with the strain of processing information that overturned every assumption he'd made about his marriage. "If Vivian had this much money, why didn't she contribute more to our household expenses? Why did she live like a middle-class woman?" "Because that's who she chose to be," Margaret explained patiently. "Mrs. Sterling wanted to build a marriage based on love and compatibility, not financial dependency. She lived modestly to ensure that any man who loved her was responding to her character, not her bank account." The irony was devastating in its completeness. Richard had criticized Vivian for exactly the qualities that proved her authenticity: her refusal to flaunt wealth, her satisfaction with simple pleasures, her focus on building emotional connection rather than social status. Every complaint he'd made about her lack of ambition had been a rejection of choices that demonstrated her genuine character. Travis chose that moment to enter the office, his press credentials providing access that security couldn't question. "Sorry to interrupt," he said with the casual confidence of someone holding devastating evidence, "but I think there's something everyone should see." He placed a series of photographs on Richard's desk beside the financial documents, images that told a story more damaging than any verbal accusation could convey. Brooke adjusting what appeared to be padding under her flowing dress. Brooke meeting with Marcus Webb at expensive restaurants throughout the city. Brooke entering Richard's building with different men over a period of months. Your girlfriend's pregnancy is as fake as her spiritual awakening techniques, Travis said bluntly. Her real name is Rebecca Williams, and she's made a career of targeting wealthy men during vulnerable transitions. This is her fourth attempt at divorce fraud, and you've been her most cooperative victim yet. Brooke's carefully constructed facade began to crumble under the weight of photographic evidence. Those pictures are taken out of context, she protested, but her hand moved unconsciously to her midsection, where the padding had shifted during her dramatic pregnancy announcement. Would you like to explain the context? Margaret asked with predatory politeness. Because these photographs suggest a pattern of behavior that federal prosecutors might find very interesting. Richard stared at the evidence with the expression of someone watching his entire world collapse in real time. The spiritual awakening that had felt so authentic, the pregnancy that had seemed like divine validation. The authentic love that had convinced him to abandon his family, all of it, had been manufactured by a professional con artist who'd studied his psychological vulnerabilities and exploited them with surgical precision. Get out, Richard told Brooke, his voice barely above a whisper. Just get out. But what about our baby? Brooke asked, maintaining her performance even as the evidence of her deception spread across the desk like accusations written in black and white. There is no baby, Richard said, his voice growing stronger with each word of recognition. There never was a baby. There was never anything real between us. You've been lying to me about everything, and I've been lying to myself about what I really wanted. Brooke gathered her purse and jacket with the dignity of someone whose con had been exposed, but whose escape route remained intact. She'd failed to extract money from Richard Sterling, but she'd learned valuable lessons about researching targets more thoroughly before investing months in manipulation. As the door closed behind her, Richard found himself alone with his pregnant wife, his family's attorney, and evidence of the most catastrophic mistake he'd ever made. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that no amount of apology could bridge. Vivian, Richard said finally, his voice carrying desperation that 3 hours earlier would have seemed impossible. We can work this out. The divorce was a mistake. I was confused, overwhelmed with business pressure, manipulated by someone who understood my weaknesses better than I understood them myself. Vivian stood slowly, her hand supporting her lower back as she prepared to deliver words that would change both their lives forever. No, Richard, you weren't confused. You were cruel. You weren't manipulated into serving me divorce papers while I was 7 months pregnant. You chose to do that yourself. The Harper Airlines empire would survive Richard's betrayal, but his daughter would grow up knowing that her father had chosen fantasy over family, ego gratification over loyalty, and temporary validation over permanent love. Some bridges become impossible to rebuild once they've been burned completely, and Richard Sterling had just discovered that his midlife transformation had cost him access to everything he'd never known he wanted. Richard's face went through 5 different emotions in 10 seconds, landing on naked greed. The silence in Richard's office stretched like a fault line, preparing to unleash an earthquake. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, San Francisco continued its daily rhythm 40 stories below, oblivious to the family dynasty reshaping itself in a corporate boardroom. Richard stared at the financial documents spread across his mahogany desk, his brain struggling to process numbers that defied comprehension. Harper Airlines stock certificates bore his wife's name not as a beneficiary or inheritance recipient, but as the primary shareholder of an empire worth $12.6 billion, real estate holdings spanning 6 states, from Manhattan penthouses to Colorado ski lodges, investment portfolios that generated more money in quarterly interest than his entire net worth, trust fund statements that read like the budget of small nations. This is impossible, Richard whispered for the 3rd time, his voice cracking under the weight of recognition. You bought groceries with coupons. You drove a Honda Civic. You worked as a marketing coordinator for $42,000 a year. I wanted to be loved for myself, Vivian replied, her hand moving protectively over her belly, where their daughter seemed to sense the tension radiating through the room. Not my family's financial independence. Every choice I made was designed to ensure that any man who loved me was responding to my character, not my bank account. Margaret Whitfield observed Richard's emotional transformation with the clinical interest of someone who'd witnessed similar revelations destroy marriages, partnerships, and entire family legacies. First came disbelief, the human mind's natural resistance to information that overturns fundamental assumptions. Then recognition, as scattered memories realign themselves into a new understanding of reality. Vivian's uncanny knowledge of business strategy during dinner conversations. Her calm confidence during financial stress that would have terrified most people earning modest salaries. Her insistence on living below their means despite Richard's pressure to upgrade their lifestyle to match his growing success. Her refusal to be impressed by his wealth or intimidated by his business connections. But the emotion that settled across Richard's features like a mask was neither remorse nor embarrassment. It was calculation. Margaret recognized the expression from 40 years of family law practice. The moment when love transforms into negotiation, and authentic connection becomes financial opportunity. "Vivian, sweetheart," Richard said, his voice suddenly tender in a way that made Margaret's skin crawl. "We can work this out. The divorce was obviously a mistake. I was confused, overwhelmed with business pressure, vulnerable to manipulation from someone who understood my weaknesses." "No," Vivian said simply, the word carrying more power than entire legal arguments. "You weren't confused when you served me divorce papers while I was 7 months pregnant. You weren't vulnerable when you moved your mistress into our home and threw away our family photos. You made conscious choices about who you wanted to be, and I'm making conscious choices about who I refuse to accept." Richard's desperation became palpable as the magnitude of his mistake crystallized into sharp focus. "Vivian, you have to understand Brooke manipulated me. She made me believe that what we had was spiritual connection, that my dissatisfaction with our marriage was about finding my authentic self rather than basic infidelity." "Brooke didn't make you cruel," Vivian replied, standing slowly from her chair with the dignity of someone who'd reclaimed her own power. "She didn't force you to criticize my appearance while I was carrying your child. She didn't make you demand that I contribute more financially to our household while you planned to abandon me for someone you thought was prettier and more spiritual." The truth was becoming unavoidable. Richard's midlife transformation hadn't been about spiritual awakening or authentic self-discovery. It had been about narcissistic abuse patterns that made him vulnerable to manipulation from someone whose professional expertise involved destroying families for profit. Travis moved toward the window, giving the family space while remaining close enough to document any threats or attempts at intimidation. His investigation had revealed not just Brooke's criminal history, but Richard's active participation in emotional abuse that had preceded her arrival by months. "You complained about my pregnancy weight gain," Vivian continued, her voice growing stronger with each acknowledgement of truth she'd been avoiding for months. "You criticized my lack of ambition while I was building a home where you could focus on your business. You demanded that I be grateful for your financial support while sitting on wealth that could have solved every problem you claimed to face." Richard's business partner Shane knocked on the office door, then entered without waiting for permission. The expression on his face suggested he'd overheard enough of the conversation to understand the implications for Sterling Technologies and everyone who depended on their success. "Richard," Shane said carefully, "Harper Airlines contracts with major tech companies throughout the industry. If this divorce becomes public knowledge, it could destroy our professional relationships and tank our client base overnight." That aspect hadn't occurred to Richard, the possibility that his personal decisions might create professional consequences extending far beyond his own life. Harper Airlines influenced industries ranging from aerospace to hospitality, with political connections that reached the highest levels of government. Alienating one of America's most powerful families wouldn't just cost him personally, it could destroy everything he'd built and everyone who'd helped him build it. "There's still time to fix this," Shane continued, his voice carrying the desperation of someone watching his own future collapse. "Whatever apologies need to be made, whatever bridges need to be rebuilt, whatever legal arrangements need to be restructured, we fix this before it destroys everything we've worked for." But Vivian had already made her decision. "The divorce proceeds as planned," she said with finality that left no room for negotiation or manipulation. "I won't be married to someone who sees me as disposable the moment someone younger and more convenient appears." Margaret began gathering the financial documents with the satisfaction of someone whose strategy had unfolded exactly as planned. "Mr. Sterling, You have 24 hours to consider your position. After that, the prenup you signed becomes permanently binding, and your window for reconsideration closes forever. The prenup, the document Richard had insisted upon to protect his assets from a woman he'd assumed was seeking his money. The same legal instrument that would now protect Vivian's billions from a man whose true character had been revealed through his choices during her most vulnerable period. "This isn't over," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'll contest the prenup. I'll claim fraud, misrepresentation, whatever legal grounds exist for invalidating a document signed under false pretenses." "You're welcome to try," Margaret replied with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case involving more than $10 million. But Mrs. Sterling never lied about her background. She simply chose to live authentically rather than flaunt wealth that she wanted to keep separate from your relationship. Your failure to investigate her family connections demonstrates negligence on your part, not fraud on hers. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Richard had been so focused on protecting his own assets that he'd never considered investigating hers. His assumptions about her middle-class background had been based on prejudice and stereotype rather than facts. And those assumptions had shaped a prenup that now protected the very wealth he desperately wanted to access. Vivian moved toward the door, her pregnancy making each step deliberate and careful. "Goodbye, Richard. I hope you find whatever it is you're really looking for. But you won't find it by abandoning people who love you for people who see you as an opportunity." As the door closed behind her, Richard slumped in his chair, surrounded by evidence of the most expensive mistake in American divorce history. His millionaire ex-husband status had just been revealed as a cosmic joke. He wasn't divorcing a middle-class woman. He was losing access to an empire that could have secured his daughter's future for generations. The numbers on the financial statements seemed to mock him with their magnitude. $12.6 billion. More money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. More power than he'd ever imagined possible. More security than any family could ever need. All of it walking away because he'd chosen temporary validation over permanent love. Because he'd confused manipulation for spiritual awakening. Because he'd underestimated the woman who loved him authentically for 3 years while he'd been too blind to recognize the gift he'd been given. Outside his office windows, San Francisco glittered in the afternoon sun. Millions of lights representing millions of dreams. Some dreams died in corporate boardrooms over financial documents, but others were just beginning to take shape in the hearts of women strong enough to walk away from men who couldn't recognize their worth. Richard Sterling had just learned that his midlife transformation had cost him everything worth having, and the lesson had come too late to change the outcome. Richard's lawyer called an emergency meeting when he realized his client might lose everything to a prenup protecting billions. Within 24 hours of discovering his wife's true wealth, Richard had transformed from a confident man pursuing spiritual fulfillment into a desperate strategist fighting for financial survival. His penthouse apartment, which had seemed luxurious when he was married to a marketing coordinator, now felt modest compared to the dynasty he was losing. The city lights that had once represented possibility now mocked him with their reminder that somewhere in those glittering towers, his pregnant wife commanded resources that could reshape entire industries. David Chen worked through the night, researching precedents for invalidating prenuptial agreements signed under conditions of alleged misrepresentation. His law office, normally quiet after business hours, hummed with activity as paralegals searched databases and senior partners consulted with colleagues across the country. The stakes had never been higher in David's 15-year career. His client faced the possibility of walking away from $12.6 billion over a divorce that had seemed routine 48 hours earlier. "We're claiming fraud based on misrepresentation of assets," David explained to Richard during their emergency meeting, his normally pristine appearance disheveled from stress and caffeine. "Vivian failed to disclose the full extent of her wealth, which prevented you from making an informed decision about the prenup's terms." "But she never lied," Richard replied, pacing between windows that offered a view of the financial district where his wife's family conducted business worth more than most countries' annual budgets. "She just didn't volunteer information about her background." "That's the challenge," David admitted, loosening his tie as if the office had become unbearably hot. "California courts generally uphold prenups unless there's evidence of coercion, fraud, or unconscionability. Your wife's decision to live modestly doesn't constitute fraud, it constitutes personal choice." Meanwhile, Margaret Whitfield prepared her counterattack with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 3 decades protecting family fortunes from exactly this type of desperate legal maneuvering. Her corner office at Harper Family Headquarters overlooked the private airfield where company jets prepared for flights that would carry board members to emergency meetings in New York, London, and Tokyo. Mr. Sterling's legal strategy is predictable, Margaret told Howard Harper, who sat behind his massive desk reviewing contingency plans that had been prepared years earlier. He'll claim fraud, demand financial records, and attempt to delay proceedings until media pressure forces a settlement. Howard nodded with the calm authority of someone who'd built an empire by anticipating challenges and neutralizing threats before they could gain momentum. What's our exposure? Minimal, Margaret replied with satisfaction. The prenup was drafted by our finest attorneys, reviewed by independent counsel, and signed after a 30-day waiting period that eliminated any claims of coercion. Richard's failure to investigate his wife's background demonstrates negligence, not grounds for invalidation. But Richard's desperation was creating complications that extended far beyond legal proceedings. Within hours of the revelation, news of the divorce had leaked to industry publications, creating shockwaves throughout the technology sector where Sterling Technologies had built relationships with major clients. Every major contract is being reviewed, Shane Parker told Richard during an emergency board meeting, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Harper Airlines influences aerospace, hospitality, transportation, and corporate travel industries. Our clients are asking whether doing business with us might jeopardize their relationships with the Harper family. The personal had become professional, the private had become public, and the consequences were expanding like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Richard's midlife transformation wasn't just destroying his marriage, it was threatening the livelihoods of every employee who depended on Sterling Technologies for their financial security. We need damage control, Richard said, but his voice lacked the confidence that had once commanded boardrooms and inspired investor confidence. Crisis management, public relations, whatever it takes to contain this situation. There's only one solution, Shane replied bluntly. You fix things with Vivian. Whatever apologies need to be made, whatever legal concessions need to be offered, whatever personal sacrifices need to be accepted, you fix this before it destroys everything we've built. But some bridges become impossible to rebuild once they've been burned completely. Richard had served divorce papers to a pregnant billionaire while abandoning her for a con artist whose fake pregnancy had been designed to accelerate his financial destruction. The level of betrayal, disrespect, and sheer stupidity involved in his choices had created consequences that apologies couldn't address. Media coverage began within 48 hours, transforming Richard's personal crisis into public entertainment. Tech millionaire divorces airline heiress became the headline that defined conversations in coffee shops, corporate boardrooms, and social media platforms across the country. Financial journalists analyzed the prenup's implications. Relationship experts debated the psychology of midlife affairs, and social commentators questioned the wisdom of men who abandoned pregnant wives for younger women. This is becoming a cautionary tale. Richard's public relations consultant warned during an emergency strategy session. The narrative writes itself: successful man destroys family for fake spiritual awakening, loses billions in process. Every interview request, every article, every social media post reinforces the same message: you made the most expensive mistake in divorce history. Richard watched his reputation disintegrate in real time as industry colleagues distanced themselves from the scandal. Board positions evaporated, speaking engagements were canceled, and business partnerships that had taken years to build dissolved overnight. His professional network, carefully cultivated through decades of relationship building, abandoned him with the efficiency of people protecting their own interests. The market doesn't forgive stupidity, one former client explained during a termination call that Richard would replay in his mind for years. Your personal decisions reflect your judgment, and your judgment determines whether we trust you with our business. Right now, we don't. But the most devastating consequence wasn't financial. It was the recognition that his actions had been observed and documented by his unborn daughter's future. Every newspaper article, every social media post, every legal filing would become part of a permanent record that would follow his child throughout her life. Vivian's daughter would grow up knowing that her father had abandoned her mother during pregnancy for a con artist whose fake spiritual awakening had been designed to destroy families. No amount of apology or legal maneuvering could change the fundamental truth that Richard Sterling had revealed his character during the most important test of his life, and he'd failed catastrophically. At Harper family headquarters, Howard reviewed reports from attorneys, financial advisors, and crisis management specialists who'd been monitoring the situation with professional detachment. "How long before this resolves itself?" he asked Margaret. "Richard will fight for 6 to 8 months," Margaret predicted with the accuracy of someone who'd seen similar cases destroy men who overestimated their legal options. "His lawyers will exhaust every possible appeal, delay tactic, and media strategy before accepting that the prenup is binding and his position is hopeless." "And Vivian?" "Your granddaughter has made her decision," Margaret replied with approval. "She won't be manipulated by apologies, intimidated by legal threats, or swayed by public pressure." Richard Sterling had his chance to love her authentically, and he chose fantasy over family. The battle lines had been drawn, the legal strategies had been implemented, and the media narrative had been established. Richard Sterling would spend the next several months discovering that some mistakes create consequences too expensive to undo, while Vivian Harper Sterling prepared to raise her daughter with the knowledge that authentic love requires character that her father had proven he didn't possess. The Harper dynasty would survive and strengthen, protected by women who understood that financial independence meant never having to accept being anyone's second choice. The baby decided to arrive right in the middle of Richard's testimony about asset division. At 36 weeks pregnant, Grace Harper Sterling made her entrance into the world with the dramatic timing that would define her character for years to come. Vivian's water broke at precisely 10:15 a.m., just as Richard finished explaining to the family court judge why his wife's failure to disclose her billions constituted grounds for invalidating their prenuptial agreement. "Your Honor," Richard was saying, his voice carrying the desperation of someone watching his last legal option slip away, "my wife deliberately concealed assets that would have fundamentally altered my understanding of our financial arrangement. The prenup was signed under false pretenses that prevented me from making informed decisions about—" Vivian gasped, her hand gripping the gallery railing as warm fluids soaked through her maternity dress onto the courthouse floor. The contraction that followed was sharp enough to double her over, and Margaret immediately stood from her position at the plaintiff's table. "Your Honor, we need to recess," Margaret announced with the authority of someone who'd practiced family law long enough to recognize genuine medical emergencies. "Mrs. Sterling is in active labor." The courtroom erupted in controlled chaos as bailiffs called for medical assistance, and reporters realized they were witnessing the most dramatic divorce hearing in California history. Richard stared at his pregnant wife with an expression that cycled through confusion, concern, and the dawning recognition that his daughter was about to be born during their custody battle. "This isn't supposed to happen for another month," Richard said, his prepared legal arguments forgotten as he watched Vivian breathe through another contraction with the focused intensity of someone whose body had decided to override everyone's schedule. "Babies arrive when they're ready," Vivian replied through gritted teeth, her hand protective over her belly, where Grace was apparently eager to meet the chaos her parents had created. "Your daughter doesn't care about your legal strategy." "Richard." The ambulance arrived within minutes, but Howard Harper's helicopter landed on the courthouse roof even faster. At 72, Howard commanded resources that made emergency medical transport seem routine, and his great-granddaughter would receive the finest obstetric care available, regardless of where labor chose to begin. "We're taking Vivian to UCSF," Howard announced with the calm authority of someone who'd handled family crises across 6 decades. "Their neonatal intensive care unit is the best on the West Coast, and Dr. Patricia Williamson is standing by." The transfer from courthouse to hospital took on the qualities of a military operation, with Harper Family Security coordinating with San Francisco Emergency Services to ensure safe passage through city traffic. Richard found himself relegated to observer status as his wife's family managed the medical emergency with efficiency that highlighted the resources he'd been too blind to recognize. At the hospital, Richard paced the private waiting room that Howard had secured through connections that reached the highest levels of California Healthcare Administration. The space was comfortable but sterile, decorated with abstract art that couldn't distract from the magnitude of what was happening 3 floors above. His daughter was being born, while her parents fought over billions of dollars in family court. "This is insane," Richard muttered, checking his watch for the 100th time in 30 minutes. "Grace isn't due for another month." The doctors said first babies usually arrive late, not early. "Stress can trigger premature labor," Maureen Sterling observed from her position near the windows that offered a view of the city where her son was discovering the consequences of his choices. She'd arrived at the hospital within an hour of receiving Richard's call, carrying flowers and a baby blanket that seemed pitifully inadequate given the circumstances. "Maybe this is a sign," Richard continued, his voice carrying desperate hope that divine intervention might somehow undo the damage he'd inflicted on his family. "Maybe Grace's early arrival means we're supposed to work things out, that the universe is giving us another chance to get this right." Maureen studied her son with the mixture of love and disappointment that only mothers can master. "Richard, your daughter's birth doesn't erase the choices you made. It doesn't change the fact that you abandoned her mother for a con artist, or that you've spent 6 months proving you can't recognize authentic love when it's offered freely." 3 floors above, Vivian labored through contractions that seemed to intensify with each hour, her focus entirely on bringing Grace safely into a world that was already more complicated than any child should inherit. Margaret sat beside the hospital bed, handling legal calls and media inquiries with one hand while holding Vivian's hand with the other. "How's Richard handling this?" Vivian asked between contractions, her voice strained but still concerned for the man who'd abandoned her during the most vulnerable period of her pregnancy. "Like someone who's finally confronting the magnitude of what he's losing," Margaret replied honestly. "But concern for your well-being doesn't undo months of narcissistic abuse. Sweetheart, good men don't serve divorce papers to pregnant wives, regardless of what spiritual awakening they claim to be experiencing." Dr. Patricia Williamson entered the delivery room with the calm competence of someone who delivered thousands of babies under every conceivable circumstance. "How are we feeling? Vivian ready to meet your daughter?" "She's ready to meet us," Vivian replied, feeling another contraction build with the intensity that meant Grace would arrive soon. She's got her grandfather's sense of dramatic timing. At 11:47 p.m., Grace Harper Sterling made her official entrance into the world 6 pounds, 2 ounces of perfect health despite her early arrival. She emerged with dark hair that matched her mother's and her father's stubborn chin, but her eyes held the alert intelligence that would define Harper women for generations. Richard stood at the nursery window 20 minutes later, watching his daughter sleep in the specialized care unit with an expression of wonder that temporarily overshadowed his legal and financial panic. Grace was beautiful in the way that newborns are beautiful, wrinkled and red, but unmistakably perfect, her tiny hands already grasping at everything within reach. "She's incredible," Richard whispered, his voice thick with emotions that lawyers and financial documents couldn't address. "Look at her. Mom, she's absolutely perfect." "She's a Harper," Maureen replied with satisfaction, recognizing the family resemblance that would connect Grace to generations of strong women who'd built empires and protected their families from men who couldn't recognize their worth. "She'll grow up knowing her value isn't determined by people who see her as disposable." The next morning brought visitors that highlighted the different worlds Grace had inherited. Travis Montgomery arrived with flowers and a vintage copy of The Little Prince, while Shane Parker brought corporate gifts that seemed absurdly inadequate given the Harper family's resources. The contrast was stark, Richard's business associates offering symbolic gestures, while Vivian's family provided private medical care, armed security, and the kind of protection that billions could buy. Howard Harper held his great-granddaughter with the tenderness of someone who'd waited 72 years to experience this particular joy. "She's got the Harper determination," he said, watching Grace grip his finger with surprising strength. "Look at that grasp, she's already holding on to what's hers." But the most significant visitor was the one who didn't come. Brooke Meadows had disappeared from San Francisco within hours of her con being exposed, moving on to her next target in another city where her fake pregnancy and manufactured spiritual awakening could destroy a different family. She left behind only unpaid rent and forwarding addresses that led nowhere. Another chapter in a criminal career that had perfected the art of exploiting men's midlife vulnerabilities. Richard spent 3 days at the hospital, sleeping in waiting room chairs and eating cafeteria food while trying to process the magnitude of his mistake. Every nurse who congratulated him on his beautiful daughter also asked about his wife's condition, forcing him to explain repeatedly that they were in the middle of divorce proceedings. "Your wife seems like a lovely woman," one nurse commented after checking Grace's vital signs. "She's been so gracious to all the staff, despite everything she's going through. You're very lucky." Lucky. The word felt like mockery coming from someone who didn't understand that Richard had thrown away the greatest fortune in American history for a woman whose pregnancy had been purchased online for theatrical props. On Grace's third day of life, Richard made a decision that would define his relationship with his daughter forever. He withdrew his legal challenges to the prenup, signed away his parental rights to ensure Grace would inherit her full Harper legacy without complications, and released any claim to Vivian's assets or future financial support. "It's not noble," Richard told David Chen during their final attorney-client meeting. "It's practical. I can't compete with a $12 billion family fortune, and fighting will only destroy my business and reputation completely. Grace deserves better than a father who's become a cautionary tale about midlife stupidity." David reviewed the documents with the relief of someone whose most challenging case was finally reaching resolution. "This protects you from further legal exposure and allows you to rebuild your professional reputation," he agreed. "But Richard, you're signing away any relationship with your daughter. Are you certain this is what you want?" Richard stared out his lawyer's window at the city where his daughter would grow up with opportunities he couldn't have imagined, even in his most ambitious dreams. "What I want is irrelevant now. Grace will have the best education money can buy, connections that reach the highest levels of government and business, and financial security that extends for generations. My job is to make sure my mistakes don't limit her possibilities." The irony was complete. Richard's final act as Vivian's husband was the first genuinely selfless decision he'd made in months. But it came too late to repair the damage he'd inflicted on their family. Too late to demonstrate the character that might have justified forgiveness. Vivian signed the custody documents from her hospital bed, Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms while Margaret handled the legal formalities with efficient professionalism. "Are you certain about this?" Margaret asked, though she already knew Vivian's answer. "Grace deserves a father who chooses her consistently," Vivian replied, her voice carrying the strength that came from finally accepting painful truths. "Richard has shown me who he is when faced with difficult choices. I believe him now." 6 weeks later, Vivian stood in the nursery that had been prepared at the Harper family estate. Grace sleeping in a crib that overlooked the private airfield where Harper Airlines jets took off and landed throughout the day. The room was decorated in soft yellows and greens, with family photos spanning 4 generations of Harper women who'd built legacies and protected their children from men who couldn't recognize their worth. "Your great-grandfather built this empire so his family would never be vulnerable," Vivian told her daughter during their nightly ritual. "But I learned something important during these past months. Real strength isn't hiding who you are. It's being brave enough to be yourself and strong enough to walk away from people who don't value you." Grace stirred in her sleep, her tiny hand grasping at dreams that would someday include private jets, international boarding schools, and political connections that reached the highest levels of power. But more importantly, she would grow up knowing that her mother had chosen dignity over desperation, authentic love over manufactured acceptance, and financial independence over emotional dependence on men who saw women as replaceable. The Harper dynasty would continue, strengthened by another generation of women who understood that some things, self-respect, authentic relationships, and the protection of children were worth more than any amount of money that apologies or legal maneuvering could secure. Richard Sterling had learned that his midlife transformation cost him everything worth having. But Grace Harper Sterling would inherit the knowledge that her value was never dependent on men who couldn't recognize the gifts they'd been given. Women supporting women meant teaching daughters that they should never accept being anyone's second choice, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away from people who've proven they don't deserve the loyalty they've been offered. Richard's last act as Vivian's husband was the first honorable thing he'd done in months. 1 year later, Vivian stood in her childhood bedroom at the Harper estate, now converted into Grace's nursery, watching her daughter take her first tentative steps across hardwood floors that had supported 4 generations of Harper women. The room overlooked the private airfield where company jets carried board members to meetings that shaped international commerce, but this morning, The only thing that mattered was Grace's determined effort to reach her favorite teddy bear. "Come on, sweetheart," Vivian encouraged, kneeling on the floor with her arms outstretched. "You can do it. Harper women don't give up." Grace wobbled forward with the concentrated determination that had characterized her personality since birth. Her dark hair catching sunlight that streamed through windows designed to offer panoramic views of the family's aviation empire. When she finally reached her mother's arms, her delighted laugh filled the room with joy that felt like healing after months of legal battles and media scrutiny. The divorce had been finalized 8 months earlier, with Richard's complete capitulation surprising even Margaret Whitfield, who'd prepared for extended litigation that could have lasted years. Instead, Richard had signed away his parental rights, released all claims to Vivian's assets, and moved to Portland, where he'd started a small consulting firm that earned enough to support his modest lifestyle while keeping him far from the scandal that had destroyed his reputation in San Francisco. "Your daddy sends a card every month," Vivian told Grace during their daily routine, though the baby was more interested in exploring the buttons on her mother's blouse than understanding complex family dynamics. With pictures of Oregon and letters explaining how sorry he is for the choices he made when you were born. The cards arrived with clockwork regularity, always addressed to Grace but clearly intended for Vivian's consideration. Richard wrote about his new life in Portland, his work with small businesses that couldn't afford major consulting firms, and his gradual understanding of how profoundly he'd miscalculated everything that had mattered. But he never asked for custody, never requested visits, and never suggested that his regret entitled him to forgiveness. Travis Montgomery had become Grace's unofficial uncle, visiting monthly with gifts that reflected his journalist's instinct for finding unique treasures during his investigations. Today he'd brought a vintage children's book about aviation that seemed perfect for a baby whose family owned half the sky. "How's our favorite heiress doing?" Travis asked, settling into the comfortable chair that had been Vivian's reading spot throughout childhood. "Still planning to take over the family business by age 2? "She's got her great-grandfather's ambition," Vivian replied, watching Grace examine her new book with the focused intensity that suggested she was already developing the strategic thinking that had built the Harper empire. Yesterday, she figured out how to open the safety latches on her toy chest. "Howard says she's showing early signs of problem-solving abilities that will serve her well in corporate boardrooms." The Harper family had embraced Grace with the protective love that came from understanding exactly how precious she was, not just as the next generation of their dynasty, but as proof that their values had survived the challenge of Richard's betrayal. Howard spent hours each day with his great-granddaughter, teaching her about airplanes through picture books and explaining business concepts through games that seemed impossibly advanced for a 1-year-old. "She's going to be formidable," Travis observed, watching Grace attempt to turn pages that were still too complex for her developing motor skills. "Strong women usually come from families that teach them their worth early." Shane Parker had visited twice since Grace's birth, both times carrying corporate gifts and awkward apologies for his former business partner's behavior. Sterling Technologies had survived Richard's scandal, but never recovered its previous momentum. Shane had bought out Richard's shares and rebuilt the company under new management, but the Harper Airlines contracts that could have elevated them to industry leadership were permanently beyond reach. "Richard asks about you both in every email," Shane had mentioned during his most recent visit, his voice carrying the discomfort of someone delivering messages between people who'd burned bridges too completely for direct communication. "He wants you to know that he understands why forgiveness isn't possible, but he hopes Grace will someday understand that his mistakes don't reflect on her worth." Vivian had accepted these messages with the polite distance that protected her from reopening wounds that had finally begun to heal. Richard's regret was genuine. His understanding of his mistakes was complete, and his respect for her decision to exclude him from Grace's life was absolute. But none of that changed the fundamental truth that he'd revealed his character during the most important test of their marriage. And character wasn't something that apologies could rebuild. Margaret Whitfield remained the family's primary attorney, but her role had evolved from crisis management to legacy planning as the Harper dynasty adapted to include another generation. Grace's trust fund is structured to provide complete financial independence while encouraging productive contribution to society, Margaret explained during their quarterly review. "She'll never need to depend on anyone for economic security, but she'll be expected to use her advantages responsibly." The numbers were staggering even by Harper standards. Grace's inheritance would exceed $20 billion by the time she reached majority. But more importantly, she would inherit a name that opened doors and commanded respect across multiple industries. The Harper legacy wasn't just about money, it was about influence, connections, and the responsibility that came with generational wealth. Your great-grandmother always said that Harper women have obligations that extend beyond personal happiness. Howard told Grace during their daily walks around the estate grounds. At 1 year old, she couldn't understand his words, but she seemed to absorb the gravity of his tone and the weight of expectations that would shape her entire future. The media attention had gradually faded as other scandals captured public interest, but Richard Sterling's name had become permanently associated with the most expensive midlife crisis in divorce history. Business schools used his case as a cautionary tale about the dangers of abandoning long-term relationships for short-term gratification, while relationship experts analyzed his psychological vulnerabilities as examples of how narcissistic abuse patterns made men susceptible to manipulation from professional predators. Brooke Meadows had been arrested in Phoenix 6 months after leaving San Francisco, charged with fraud, identity theft, and racketeering in connection with her systematic targeting of wealthy men across multiple states. Her trial would begin in the fall, with Richard listed as a witness for the prosecution despite his reluctance to relive his humiliation in federal court. Justice doesn't erase the damage she caused, Vivian reflected, reading news articles about Brooke's arrest while Grace napped in her arms, but maybe it prevents her from destroying other families the way she destroyed ours. On Grace's first birthday, the Harper family hosted a celebration that reflected both their wealth and their values. The guest list included business leaders, political figures, and family friends, but the focus remained entirely on the child whose future would extend the Harper legacy into the next century. Grace wore a tiny designer dress and received gifts that ranged from handmade toys to trust fund contributions that would fund her education at the finest institutions in the world. But the most meaningful gift arrived by mail, a letter from Richard that would be saved until Grace was old enough to understand its contents. In careful handwriting, he'd written about his love for her, his regret for the choices that had excluded him from her life, and his hope that she would grow up knowing her worth wasn't determined by her father's failures. "I know I have no right to ask for anything," the letter concluded, "but if you ever decide you want to meet the man who helped create you, I'll be in Portland, trying to become someone worthy of your consideration. Your mother was right to protect you from the person I was when you were born, but I'm working every day to become the person I should have been all along." Vivian read the letter while Grace slept in her crib, surrounded by birthday gifts and family photos that told the story of women who'd built empires and protected their children from men who couldn't recognize their worth. The words were sincere, the regret was genuine, and the respect for her decisions was complete. But forgiveness wasn't something that could be earned through apologies, it was something that had to be freely given. And Vivian wasn't ready to give it. "Your daddy wants to be part of your life," she told Grace during their nightly ritual, though the baby was more interested in the mobile that played classical music above her crib. "Someday, when you're old enough to understand complicated things, you'll get to decide whether his regret justifies taking that risk." The question wasn't whether Richard deserved a second chance. It was whether Vivian was strong enough to define forgiveness on her own terms, in her own time, according to her own understanding of what Grace needed for her development and security. Outside the nursery windows, San Francisco glittered in the evening light, millions of dreams represented by millions of lights. Some dreams died in kitchen conversations over divorce papers, but others were just beginning to take shape in the hearts of women who'd learned that authentic love required character that couldn't be faked or manufactured. Grace Harper Sterling would grow up knowing that her mother had chosen dignity over desperation, financial independence over emotional dependence, and authentic relationships over manufactured spiritual awakening. She would inherit not just billions of dollars, but the knowledge that her worth was never dependent on men who couldn't recognize the gifts they'd been given. The Harper dynasty would continue, strengthened by another generation of women who understood that some things, self-respect, authentic love, and the protection of children were worth more than any amount of money that apologies could offer. Richard Sterling had learned that his midlife transformation cost him everything worth having, but Grace Harper Sterling would inherit the knowledge that she should never accept being anyone's second choice. And sometimes, The greatest act of love is walking away from people who've proven they don't deserve the loyalty they've been offered freely. As Vivian turned off the nursery lights and headed toward her own bedroom in the Harper family estate, she felt something she hadn't experienced in over a year, complete peace with her choices. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new decisions about Grace's future. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, home, safe, and surrounded by people who would never see her as disposable. Women supporting women meant teaching the next generation that authentic love was worth waiting for, that financial independence was worth protecting, and that some bridges were worth burning to protect the people you love most. The story was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for Grace Harper Sterling to write her own chapters in a legacy that had survived and strengthened through the choices of women who refused to be anyone's second choice.